Frankenstein, chapters 8, 9, and 10. We passed a few sad hours until 11 o'clock, when the trial was to commence. My father and the rest of the family being obliged to attend as witnesses, I accompanied them to the court. During the whole of this wretched mockery of justice, I suffered living torture. It was to be decided whether the result of my curiosity and lawless devices would cause the death of two of my fellow beings. One, a smiling babe full of innocence and joy; the other, far more dreadfully murdered, with every aggravation of infamy that could make the murder memorable and horror. Justine was also a girl of merit and possessed qualities which promised to render her happy life. Now all was to be obliterated in the ignominious grave, and I the cause. 1,000 times rather would I have confessed myself guilty of the crime ascribed to Justine, but I was absent when it was committed, and such a declaration would have been considered as the ravings of a madman, and would have exculpated her, exculpated her who suffered through me. The appearance of Justine was calm. She was dressed in mourning, and her countenance, always engaging, was rendered by the solemnity of her feelings exquisitely beautiful. Yet she appeared confident in innocence, and did not tremble, although gazed on and execrated by thousands, for all the kindness which her beauty might otherwise have excited was obliterated in the minds of the spectators by the imagination of the enormity she was supposed to have committed. She was tranquil, yet her tranquillity was evidently constrained, and as her confusion had before been adduced as a proof of her guilt, she worked up her mind to an appearance of courage. When she entered the court, she threw her eyes round it, and quickly discovered where we were seated. A tear seemed to dim her eye when she saw us, but she quickly recovered herself, and a look of sorrowful affection seemed to attest her utter guiltlessness. The trial began, and her advocate against her had stated the charge. Several witnesses were called. Several strange facts combined against her, which might have staggered anyone who had not such proof of her innocence as I had. She had been out the whole of the night on which the murder had been committed, and towards morning had been perceived by a market woman not far from the spot where the body of the murdered child had been afterwards found. The woman asked her what she did there, but she looked very strangely, and only returned a confused and unintelligible answer. She returned to the house about 8 o'clock, and when one inquired where she had passed the night, she replied that she had been looking for the child, and demanded earnestly if anything had been heard concerning him. When shown the body, she fell into violent hysterics, and kept her bed for several days. The picture was then procured, which the servant had found in her pocket, and when Elizabeth, in a faltering voice, proved that it was the same which an hour before the child had been missed, she had placed around his neck, a murmur of horror and indignation filled the court. Justine was called for her defense. As the trial had proceeded, her countenance had altered. Surprise, horror, and mystery were strongly expressed. Sometimes she struggled with her tears, but when she was desired to plead, she collected her powers and spoke in an audible, although variable voice. God knows, she said, how entirely I am innocent, but I do not pretend that my protestations should acquit me. I rest my innocence on a plain and simple explanation of the facts which have been adduced against me, and I hope the character I have always borne will incline my judges as a favorable interpretation, which any circumstance appears doubtful or suspicious. She then related that, by the permission of Elizabeth, she had passed the evening of the night on which the murder had been committed at the house of an aunt in Shunned, a village situated about a league from Geneva. On her return at about 9 o'clock, she met a man who asked her if she had seen anything of a child who was lost. She was alarmed by this account, and passed several hours in looking for him when the gates of Geneva were shut, and she was forced to remain several hours of the night in a barn belonging to a cottage, being unwilling to call up the inhabitants to whom she was well known. Most of the night she spent here watching. Towards morning she believed that she slept for a few minutes. Some steps disturbed her, and she awoke. It was dawn. It was dawn, and she had quitted her asylum, that she might again endeavor to find my brother. If she had gone near the spot where his body lay, it was without her knowledge. That she had then been bewildered, it was when questioned by the market woman, who was not surprising. Let's say that again. That she had been bewildered when questioned by the market woman was not surprising, since she had passed a sleepless night and the fate of poor William was yet uncertain. Concerning the picture, she could give no account. I know, continued the unhappy victim, how heavily and fatally one circumstance weighs against me, but I have no power of explaining it. When I have expressed my utter ignorance, I am only left to conjecture concerning the probabilities by which it might have been placed in my pocket. But here I am checked. I believe that I have no enemy on earth, and none surely would be so wicked as to destroy me wantonly. Did the murderer place it there? I know of no opportunity afforded him for doing so. Or, if I had, why should he have stolen the jewel to part with it again so soon? I commit my cause to the justice of the judges, yet I see no room for hope. I beg permission to have a few witnesses examined concerning my character, and if their testimony shall not overweigh my supposed guilt, I must be condemned, although I would pledge my salvation on my innocence. Several witnesses were called who had known her for many years, and they spoke well of her, but fear and hatred of the crime of which they supposed her guilty rendered them timorous and unwilling to come forward. Elizabeth saw even this last resource, her excellent dispositions and irreproachable conduct, about to fail the accused, when, although violently agitated, she desired permission to address the court. I am, said she, the cousin of the unhappy child who was murdered, or rather his sister, for I was educated by and have lived with his parents ever since, and even long before his birth. It may therefore be judged indecent in me to come forward on this occasion, but when I see a fellow creature about to perish through the cowardice of her pretended friends, I wish to be allowed to speak, that I may say what I know of her character. I am well acquainted with the accused. I have lived in the same house with her, at one time for 5 and another for 2 years. During all that period, she appeared to me the most amiable and benevolent of human creatures. She nursed Madame Frankenstein, my aunt, in her last illness, with the greatest affection and care, and afterwards attended her own mother during a tedious illness in a manner that excited the admiration of all who knew her, after which she again lived in my uncle's house, where she was beloved by all the family. She was warmly attached to the child who is now dead, and acted towards him like a most affectionate mother. For my own part, I do not hesitate to say that notwithstanding all the evidence produced against her, I believe and rely on her perfect innocence. She had no temptation for such an action. As to the bauble on which the chief proof rests, if she had earnestly desired it, I should have willingly given it to her, so much do I esteem and value her. A murmur of approbation followed Elizabeth's simple and powerful appeal, but it was excited by her generous inference, and not in favor of poor Justine, on whom the public's indignation was turned with renewed violence, charging her with the blackest ingratitude. She herself wept as Elizabeth spoke, but she did not answer. My own agitation and anguish was extreme during the whole trial. I believed in her innocence. I knew it. Could the demon who had, I did not for a minute doubt, murdered my brother also in his hellish sport have betrayed the innocent to death and ignominy? I could not sustain the horror of my situation, and when I perceived the popular voice and countenances of the judges had already condemned my unhappy victim, I rushed out of the court in agony. The tortures of the accused did not equal mine. She was sustained by innocence, but the fangs of remorse tore my bosom and would not forego their hold. I passed a night of unmingled wretchedness. In the morning I went to the court. My lips and throat were parched. I dared not ask the fatal question, but I was known, and the officer guessed the cause of my visit. The ballots had been thrown. They were all black, and Justine was condemned. I cannot pretend to describe what I felt then. I had before experienced sensations of horror, and I have endeavored to bestow upon them adequate expressions. But words cannot convey an idea of the heart-sickening despair that I then endured. The person to whom I addressed myself added that Justine had already confessed her guilt. That evidence, he observed, was hardly required in so glaring a case, but I am glad of it, and indeed none of our judges like to condemn a criminal upon circumstantial evidence, be it ever so decisive. This was a strange and unexpected intelligence. What could it mean? Had my eyes deceived me? And was I really as mad as the whole world would believe me to be if I disclosed the object of my suspicions? I hastened to return home, and Elizabeth eagerly demanded the result. My cousin, replied I, it is decided as you have expected. All judges, rather than 10 innocent, should suffer than that one guilty should escape. But she had confessed. This was a dire blow to Elizabeth, who had relied with firmness upon Justine's innocence. Alas, said she, how shall I ever again believe in human goodness? Justine, whom I loved and esteemed as my sister, how could she put on those smiles of innocence only to betray? Her mild eyes seemed incapable of any severity or guile, and yet she has committed a murder? Soon after, we heard that the poor victim had expressed a desire to see my cousin. My father wished her not to go, but said that he left it to her own judgment and the feelings to decide. Yes, said Elizabeth, I will go, although she is guilty, and you, Victor, shall accompany me. I cannot go alone. The idea of this visit was torture to me, yet I could not refuse. We entered the gloomy prison chamber and beheld Justine sitting on some straw at the farther end. Her hands were manacled and her head rested on her knees. She rose on seeing us enter, and when we were left alone with her, she threw herself at the feet of Elizabeth, weeping bitterly. My cousin wept also. Oh, Justine, she said, why did you rob me of my last consolation? I relied on your innocence, and although I was then very wretched, I was not so miserable as I am now. And do you believe that I am so very wicked? Do you join with my enemies to crush me, to condemn me as a murderer? Her voice was suffocated with sobs. Rise, my poor girl, said Elizabeth. Why do you kneel if you are innocent? I am not one of your enemies. I believed you guiltless, notwithstanding every evidence, until I heard that you had yourself declared your guilt. That report, you say, is false? And be assured, dear Justine, that nothing can shake my confidence in you for a moment but your own confession. I did confess, but I confessed a lie. I confessed that I might obtain absolution. But now that falsehood lies heavier at my heart than ever my other sins. The God of heaven forgive me. Ever since I was condemned, my confessor had besieged me. He threatened and menaced until I almost began to think that I was the monster that he said I was. He threatened excommunication and hellfire in my last moments if I continued to endure it. Dear lady, I had none to support me. All looked on me as a wretched, doomed to ignominy and perdition. What could I do in an evil hour? I subscribed to a lie, and now only I am truly miserable. She paused, weeping, and then continued. I thought with horror, my sweet lady, that you should believe your Justine, whom your blessed aunt had so highly honored and whom you loved, was a creature capable of a crime which none but the devil himself could have perpetrated. Dear William, dearest blessed child, I soon shall see you again in heaven, where we shall all be happy, and that consoles me, going as I am to suffer ignominy and death. Oh, Justine, forgive me for having one moment of distrusted you. Why did you confess? But do not mourn, dear girl. Do not fear. I will proclaim. I will prove your innocence. I will melt the stony hearts of your enemies by the tears and prayers. You shall not die. You, my playfellow, my companion, my sister, perish on the scaffold? No, no, I never will survive so horrible a misfortune. Justine shook her head mournfully. I do not fear to die, she said. That pang is past. God raises my weakness and gives me courage to endure the worst. I leave a sad and bitter world. And if you remember me and think of me as the unjustly condemned, I am resigned to fate awaiting me. Learn from me, dear lady, to submit in patience to the will of heaven. During this conversation, I retired to a corner of the prison room where I could conceal the horrid anguish that had possessed me. Despair. Who dared talk of that? That poor victim who on the morrow was to pass the awful boundary between life and death felt not as I did such deep and bitter agony. I gnashed my teeth and ground them together, uttering a groan that came from my inmost soul. Justine started when she saw who it was. She approached me and said, Dear sir, you are so kind to visit me. You, I hope, do not believe that I am guilty? I could not answer. No, Justine, said Elizabeth. He is more convinced of your innocence than I was, for even when he heard that you had confessed, he did not credit it. I truly thank him. In these last moments, I feel the sincerest gratitude towards those who think of me with kindness. How sweet is the affection of others to such a wretch as I am. It removes more than half my misfortune, and I feel as if I could die in peace now that my innocence is acknowledged by you, dear lady, and your cousin." Thus the poor sufferer tried to comfort others and herself. She indeed gained the resignation she desired, but I, the true murderer, felt the never-dying worm alive in my bosom, which had allowed of no hope or consolation. Elizabeth also wept and was unhappy, but hers also was the misery of innocence, which, like a cloud that passes over the fair moon for a while, hides but cannot tarnish its brightness. Anguish and despair had penetrated into the core of my heart. I bore a hell within me which nothing could extinguish. We stayed several hours with Justine, and it was with great difficulty that Elizabeth could tear herself away. "I wish," cried she, "that I were to die with you. I cannot live in this world of misery." Justine assumed an air of cheerfulness. Justine assumed an air of cheerfulness, while she with difficulty repressed her bitter tears. She embraced Elizabeth and said in a voice of half-suppressed emotion, "Farewell, sweet lady. Dearest Elizabeth, my beloved and only friend. May heaven in its bounty bless and preserve you. May this be the last misfortune that you will ever suffer. Live and be happy, and make others so." And on the morrow, Justine died. Elizabeth's heart-rending eloquence failed to move the judges from their settled conviction and the criminality of the saintly sufferer. My passionate and indignant appeals were lost upon them, and when I received their cold answers and heard the harsh, unfeeling reasoning of these men, my purposed avowal died away on my lips. Thus I might proclaim myself a madman, but not revoke the sentence passed upon my wretched victim. She perished on the scaffold as a murderess. From the tortures of my own heart, I turned to contemplate the deep and voiceless grief of Elizabeth. This also was my doing. And my father's woe and the desolation that late so smiling home, all was the work of my thrice accursed hands. You weep, unhappy ones, but these are not your last tears. Again shall you raise the funeral wail, and the sound of your lamentations shall again and again be heard. Frankenstein, your son, your kinsman, your early much-loved friend, he who would spend each vital drop of blood for your sakes, who has no thought nor sense of joy except as it is mirrored also in your dear countenances, who would fill the air with blessings and spend his life in serving you. He bids you weep, to shed countless tears, happy beyond his hopes if thus inexorable fate be satisfied, and if the destructive pause before the peace of the grave have succeeded to you, sad torments. Thus spoke my prophetic soul, as, torn by remorse, horror, and despair, I beheld those I loved spend vain sorrow upon the graves of William and Justine, the first hapless victims of my unhallowed arts. Chapter 9. Nothing is more painful to the human mind than, after the feelings have been worked up by a quick succession of events, the dead calmness of inaction and certainty which follows and deprives the soul both of hope and fear. Justine had rested, and I was alive. The blood flowed freely in my veins, but a weight of despair and remorse pressed on my heart which nothing could remove. Sleep fled from my eyes. I wandered like an evil spirit, for I had committed deeds of mischief beyond the description horrible, and more, much more, I persuaded myself, as yet behind. Yet my heart overflowed with kindness for the love of virtue. I had begun life with benevolent intentions, and thirsted for the moment when I should put them in practice and make myself useful to my fellow beings. Now all was blasted. Instead of that serenity of conscience which allowed me to look back upon the past with self-satisfaction and from thence to gather promise of new hopes, I was seized by remorse and the sense of guilt, which hurried me away to a hell of intense tortures such as no language can describe. This state of mind preyed upon my health, which had perhaps never entirely recovered from the first shock it had sustained. I shunned the face of man. All sound of joy or complacency was torture to me. Solitude was my only consolation, deep, dark, deathlike solitude. My father observed with pain the alteration perceptible in my disposition and habits, and endeavored by arguments deduced from the feelings of his serene conscience and guiltless life, to inspire me with fortitude and awaken in me the courage to dispel the dark cloud which brooded over me. Do you think, Victor, said he, that I do not suffer also? No one could love a child more than I loved your brother. Tears came to his eyes, and as he spoke, but it is not duty to the survivors that we should refrain from augmenting their unhappiness by an appearance of immediate grief. It is also a duty owed to yourself, for excessive sorrow prevents improvement or enjoyment, or even the discharge of daily usefulness, without which no man is fit for society. This advice, although good, was totally inapplicable to my cause. I should have been the first to hide my grief and console my friends, if remorse had not mingled its bitterness and terror its alarm with my other sensations. Now I could only answer my father with a look of despair and endeavor to hide myself from his view. About this time we retired to our house at Belrive. This change was particularly agreeable to me. The shutting of the gates regularly at 10 o'clock and the impossibility of remaining on the lake after that hour had rendered our residence within the walls of Geneva very irksome to me. I was now free. Often, rather than the rest of the family had retired for the night, I took the boat and passed many hours upon the water. Sometimes, with the sails set, I was carried by the wind, and sometimes, after rowing into the middle of the lake, I left the boat to pursue its own course and gave way to my own miserable reflection. I was often tempted, when all was at peace around me, and I the only unquiet thing that wandered restless in the scene so beautiful and heavenly. If I expect some bat or the frogs whose harsh and interrupted croakings was heard only when I approached the shore, often, I say, I was tempted to plunge into the silent lake, but the waters might close over me and my calamities forever. But I was restrained when I thought of the heroic suffering of Elizabeth, whom I tenderly loved and whose existence was bound up in mine. I thought also of my father and surviving brother. Should I, by my base desertion, leave them exposed and unprotected to the malice of the fiend whom I had let loose among them? At these moments I wept bitterly and wished that peace would revisit my mind, only that I might afford them consolation and happiness. But that could not be. Remorse extinguished every hope. I had been the author of unalterable evils, and I live in daily fear lest the monster whom I had created should perpetrate some new wickedness. I had an obscure feeling that all was not over, that he would still commit some signal crime, which, by its enormity, should almost efface the recollection of the past. There was always scope for fear so long as anything I loved remained behind. My abhorrence of this fiend cannot be conceived. When I thought of him, I gnashed my teeth, my eyes became inflamed, and I ardently wished to extinguish that life which I had so thoughtlessly bestowed. When I reflected on his crimes and malice, my hatred and revenge burst all bounds of moderation. I would have made a pilgrimage to the highest peak of the Andes, could I, when I, excuse me, could I, when there, have precipitated him to the base. I wished to see him again, that I might wreak the utmost extent of abhorrence on his head, and avenge the deaths of William and Justine. Our house was the house of mourning. My father's health was deeply shaken by the horror of the recent events. Elizabeth was sad and desponding. She no longer took delight in her ordinary occupations. All pleasure seemed to her sacrilege towards the dead. Eternal woe and tears she then thought was the just tribute she should pay to innocence so blasted and destroyed. She was no longer that happy creature who in earlier youth wandered with me on the banks of the lake and talked with ecstasy of our future prospects. The first of those sorrows which are sent to wean us from the earth had visited her, and its dimming influence quenched her dearest smiles. When I reflect, my dear cousin, said she, on the miserable death of Justine Moritz, I no longer see the world and its works as they before appeared to me. Before I looked upon the accounts of vice and injustice that I read in books or heard up from others as tales of ancient days or imaginary evils. At least they were remote and more familiar to reason than the imagination. But now misery has come, and men appear to me as monsters thirsting for each other's blood. Yet I am certainly unjust. Everybody believed that poor girl to be guilty, and if she could have committed the crime for which she suffered Assuredly, she would have been the most depraved of human creatures, for the sake of a few jewels, to have murdered the son of her benefactor and friend, a child whom she had nursed from its birth and appeared to love as if it had been her own. I could not consent to the death of any human being, but certainly I should have thought such a creature unfit to remain in the society of men. I was innocent. I know, I feel she was innocent. You are of the same opinion, and that confirms me. But alas, Victor, when falsehood can look so like the truth, who can assure themselves of certain happiness? I feel as if I were walking on the edge of a precipice towards which thousands are crowding and endeavoring to plunge me into the abyss. William and Justine were assassinated, and the murderer escapes. He walks about the world free and perhaps respected. But even if I were condemned to suffer on the scaffold for the same crimes, I would not change places with such a wretch. I listened to this discourse with the extremest agony. I, not in deed, but in effect, was the true murderer. Elizabeth read my anguish in my countenance, and kindly taking my hand, said, "My dearest friend, you must calm yourself. These events have affected me, God knows how deeply, but I am not so wretched as you are. There is an expression of despair and sometimes of revenge in your countenance that makes me tremble. Dear Victor, banish these dark passions. Remember the friends around you who center all their hopes in you. Have we lost the power of rendering you happy? Oh, while we love, while we are true to each other, here in the land of peace and beauty, your native country, we may reap every tranquil blessing. What can disturb your peace?" I could not such words from her, whom I fondly prized before every other gift of of fortune sufficed to chase away the fiend that lurked in my heart. Even as she spoke, I drew near to her, as if in terror, lest at that very moment the destroyer had been near to rob me of her. Thus not the tenderness of friendship, nor the beauty of earth, nor the heaven could redeem my soul from woe. The very accents of love were ineffectual. I was encompassed by a cloud which no beneficial influence could penetrate. The wounded deer dragging its fainting limbs to some untrodden brake, there to gaze upon the arrow which had pierced it, and die, was but a type of me. Sometimes I could cope with the sullen despair that overwhelmed me, but sometimes the whirlwind passions of my soul drove me to seek, by bodily exercise and by change of place, some relief from the intolerable sensations. It was during an access of this kind that I suddenly left my home, and, bending my steps towards the near alpine valleys, sought in the magnificence, the eternity of such scenes to forget myself and my ephemeral because human, sorrows. My wanderings were directed toward the valley of Chamonix. I had visited it frequently during my boyhood. 6 years had passed since then. I was a wreck. I was a wreck, but naught had changed in those savage and enduring scenes. I performed the first part of my journey on horseback. I afterwards hired a mule, as the more sure-footed and least liable to receive injury on such rugged roads. The weather was fine. It was about the middle of the month of August, nearly 2 months after the death of Justine. The miserable epoch from which I dated all my woe. The weight upon my spirit was sensibly lightened as I plunged yet deeper in the ravine of RV. The immense mountains and precipices that overhung me on every side, the sound of the river raging among the rocks, and the dashing of the waterfalls around spoke of a mighty power of omnipotence. And I ceased to fear or to bend before any beings less almighty than that which had created and ruled the elements, here displayed in their most terrible guise. Still, as I ascended higher, the valley assumed a more magnificent and astonishing character. Ruined castles hanging on their precipices to piney mountains, the impetuous Urive, and cottages, every here and there peeping forth from among the trees, formed a scene of singular beauty. But it was augmented and rendered sublime by the mighty Alps, whose white and shining pyramids and domes towered above all as belonging to another earth, the habitations of another race of human beings. I passed the bridge of Pelissé, where the ravine which the river forms opened before me, and I began to ascend the mountain that overhangs it. Soon after, I entered the valley of Chamonix. This valley is more wonderful and sublime, but not so beautiful and picturesque as that of the Servat, through which I had just passed. The high and snowy mountains were its immediate boundaries, but I saw no more ruined castles and fertile fields. Immense glaciers approached the road. I heard the rumbling thunder of the falling avalanche and marked the smoke of its passage. Mont Blanc, the supreme and magnificent Mont Blanc, raised itself from the surrounding aiguilles, and its tremendous dome overtook the valley. A tingling, long-lost sense of pleasure often came across me during this journey. Some term in the road, some new object suddenly perceived and recognized, rendered me days gone by, and were associated with the light-hearted gaiety of boyhood. The very winds whispered in the soothing accents, and maternal nature bade me weep no more. Then again the kindly influence ceased to act. I found myself fettered again to grief, and indulged in all the misery of reflection. Then I spurred on my animals, striving so to forget the world, my fears, and more than all myself. Or, in a more desperate fashion, I alighted and threw myself on the grass, weighed down by the horror and despair. At length I arrived at the village of Chamonix. Exhaustion succeeded to the extreme fatigue both of body and of mind which I had endured. For a short space of time I remained at the window, watching the pallid lightnings that played above Mont Blanc, and listening to the rushing of the Arve, which pursued its noisy way beneath. The same lulling sounds acted as a lullaby to my too keen sensations. When I placed my head upon my pillow, sleep crept over me. I felt it as it came, and blessed the giver of oblivion. Chapter 10. I spent the following day roaming through the valley. I stood beside the resources of the Arvillon, which takes their rise in the glacier that, with slow pace, is advancing down from the summit of the hills to barricade the valley. The abrupt sides of vast mountains were before me. The icy wall of the glacier overhung me. A few shattered pines were scattered around, and the solemn silence of this glorious presence chamber of imperial nature was broken only by the brawling waves or fall of some vast fragment. The thunder sound of the avalanche or the cracking reverberated along the mountains of the accumulated ice, which, through the silent working of immutable laws, was ever and anon rent and torn as if it had been but a plaything of their hands. These sublime and magnificent scenes afforded me the greatest consolation that I was capable of receiving. They elevated me from the littleness of feeling, and although they did not remove my grief, they subdued and tranquilized it. In some degree, also, they diverted my mind. They diverted my mind from the thoughts over which it had brooded over the last month. I retired to rest at night, my slumbers, as it were, waited on, administered by the assemblance of grand shapes which I had contemplated during the day. They congregated around me, the sustained snowy mountain top, the glittering pinnacle, the pine woods, and ragged bare ravine, the eagle soaring amidst the clouds. They all gathered round me and bade me be at peace. Where had they fled when the next morning I awoke? All of soul inspiring fled with sleep, and dark melancholy clouded every thought. The rain was pouring its torments, and its thick mists hid the summits of the mountains, so that I even saw not the faces of those mighty friends. Still, I would penetrate their misty veil and seek them in cloudy retreats. What were rain and storm to me? My mule was brought to the door, and I resolved to ascend the summit of Mount Avert. I remembered the effect that the view of the tremendous and ever-moving glacier had produced upon my mind when I first saw it. It had then filled me with a sublime ecstasy that gave wings to the soul and allowed it to soar to the obscure world to light and joy. The sight of the awful and majestic in nature had indeed always the effect of solemnizing my mind and causing me to forget the passing cares of life. I determined to go without a guide, for I was well acquainted with the path, and the presence of another would destroy the solitary grandeur of the scene. The ascent is precipitous, but the path is cut into continual and short windings which enable you to surmount the perpendicularity of the mountains. It is a scene terrifically desolate. In 1,000 spots, the traces of the winter avalanche may be perceived, where trees lie broken and strewn on the ground, some entirely destroyed, others bent, leaning upon the jutting rocks of the mountain or transversely upon other trees. The path, as you ascend higher, is intersected by ravines of snow, down which stones continually roll from above. One of them is particularly dangerous, as the slightest sound, such as even speaking in a loud voice, produces a concussion of air sufficient to draw destruction upon the head of the speaker. The pines are not tall or luxuriant, but they are somber and add an air of severity to the scene. I looked on the valley beneath. Vast mists were rising from the rivers which ran through it, and curling in thick wreaths around the opposite mountains, whose summits were hid in the uniform clouds, while rain poured from the dark sky and added to the melancholy impression I received from the objects around me. Alas, why does man boast of sensibilities superior to those apparent in the brute? It only renders them more necessary beings. If our impulses were confined to hunger, thirst, and desire, we might be nearly free. But now we are moved by every wind that blows, and a chance word or scene that the word may convey to us. We rest. A dream has power to poison sleep. We rise. One wandering thought pollutes the day. We feel, conceive, or reason, laugh or weep, embrace fond woe, or cast our cares away. It is the same, for be it joy or sorrow, the path of its departure still is free. Man's yesterday may ne'er be like his morrow. Naught may endure his mutability. It was nearly noon when I arrived at the top of the ascent. For some time I sat upon the rock that overlooks the sea of ice. A mist covered both that and the surrounding mountains. Presently a breeze dissipated the cloud, and I descended upon the glacier. The surface is very uneven, rising like the waves of a troubled sea, descending low and interspersed by rifts that sink deep. The field of ice is almost a league in width, and I spent nearly 2 hours in crossing it. The opposite mountain is a bare perpendicular rock. From the side where I now stood, Mount Everest was exactly opposite, at the distance of a league, and above it rose Mont Blanc, its awful majesty. I remained in a recess of the rock, gazing at this wonderful and stupendous scene. The sea, or rather the vast river of ice, wound among its dependent mountains, whose aerial summits hung over its recesses. Their icy and glittering peaks shone in the sunlight over the clouds. My heart, which was before sorrowful, now swelled with something like joy. I exclaimed, "Wandering spirits, if indeed you wander, and do not rest in your narrow beds, allow me this faint happiness, or take me as your companion away from the joys of life." As I said this, I suddenly beheld the figure of a man at some distance, advancing towards me with superhuman speed. He bounded over the crevices in the ice among which I had walked with caution. His stature also, as he approached, seemed to exceed that of man. I was troubled. A mist came over my eyes, and I felt a faintness seize me, but I was quickly restored by the cold gale of the mountains. I perceived, as the shape came nearer, sight tremendous and abhorred, that it was the wretch whom I had created. I trembled with rage and horror, resolving to wait his approach, and then close with him its mortal combat. He approached. His countenance bespoke bitter anguish, combined with disdain and malignity, while its unhealthy ugliness rendered it almost too horrific for human eyes. But I scarcely observed this. Rage and hatred had at first deprived me of utterance, and I recovered only to overwhelm him with words expressive of furious detestation and contempt. "Devil!" I exclaimed, "do you dare approach me? And do you not fear the fierce vengeance of my arm wreaked on your miserable head? Begone, vile insect, or rather stay, that I may trample you to dust. And oh, that I could, with the extinction of your miserable existence, restore those victims whom you have so diabolically murdered." "I expected this reception," said the demon. "All men hate the wretched. How then must I be hated, whom am miserable beyond all living things? Yet you, my creator, detest and spurn me, thy creature, to whom thou art bound by ties only dissoluble by the annihilation of one of us? You propose to kill me? How dare you sport thus with life? Do your duty towards me, and I will do mine towards you and the rest of mankind. If you will comply with my conditions, I will leave them and you at peace. But if you refuse, I will glut the maw of death until it be satiated with the blood of your remaining friends. Abhorrent monster, fiend that thou art, the tortures of hell are too mild a vengeance of thy crimes. Wretched devil, you reproach me with your creation. Come on, then, that I may extinguish the spark of life which I so negligently bestowed. My rage was without bonds. I sprang on him, impelled by all the feelings which can arm one being against the existence of another. He easily eluded me and said, "Be calm. I entreat you to hear me before you give vent to your hatred on my devoted head. Have I not suffered enough that you seek to increase my misery? Life, although it may only be an accumulation of anguish, is dear to me, and I will defend it. Remember, thou hast made me more powerful than myself. My height is superior to thine, my joints more supple, but I will not be tempted to set myself in opposition to thee. I am thy creature, and I will be even mild and docile to my natural lord and king, if thou wilt also perform thy part, the which thou owest me. O Frankenstein, be not equitable to every other, and trample upon me alone, to whom thy justice and even thy clemency and affection is most due. Remember that I am thy creature. I ought to be thy Adam, but I am rather the fallen angel whom thou derivest from joy for no misdeed. Everywhere I see bliss from which I alone am irrevocably excluded. I was benevolent and good. Misery made me a fiend. Make me happy, and I shall again be virtuous. Be gone! I will not hear you. There can be no community between you and me. We are enemies. Be gone, or let us our strength in a fight in which one must fall. How can I move thee? Will no entreaties cause thee to turn a favorable eye upon thy creature, who implores thy goodness and compassion? Believe me, Frankenstein, I was benevolent. My soul glowed with love and humanity. But am I not alone? Miserably alone? You, my creator, abhor me. What hope can I gather from your fellow creatures who owe me nothing? They spurn and hate me. The desert mountains and the dreary glaciers are my refuge. I have wandered here many days. The caves of ice, which I only do not fear, are a dwelling to me, and the only one which man does not grudge. These bleak skies I hail, for they are kinder to me than your fellow beings. If the multitude of mankind knew of my existence, they would do as you do and arm themselves for my destruction. Shall I not then hate them who abhor me? I will keep no terms with my enemies. I am miserable, and they shall share my wretchedness. Yet it is in your power to recompense me and deliver them from an evil which it only remains for you to make so great, that not only you and your family, but thousands of others shall be swallowed up in the whirlwinds of its rage. Let your compassion be moved, and do not disdain me. Listen to my tale. When you have heard that, abandon or commiserate me as you shall judge that I deserve. But hear me. The guilty are allowed by human laws, bloody as they are, to speak their own defense before they are condemned. Listen to me, Frankenstein. You accuse me of murder, and yet you would, with a satisfied conscience, destroy your own creature? Oh, praise the eternal justice of man. And I ask you not to spare me. Listen to me. And then, if you can, and if you will, destroy the work of your hands. Why do you call to my remembrance, I rejoined, circumstances of which I shudder to reflect, that I have been their miserable origin and author? Cursed be the abhorred day, abhorred devil, in which you first saw light. Cursed, although I curse myself, by the hands that formed you. You have made the wretched beyond expression. You have left me no power to consider whether I am just to you or not. Be gone, relieve me from thy sight of your detested form. Thus I relieve thee, my creator, he said, and placed his hated hands before my eyes, which I flung from me with violence. Thus I take from thee a sight which you abhor. Still thou canst listen to me and grant me thy compassion. By the virtues that I once possessed, I demand this from you. Hear my tale. It is long and strange, and the temperature of this place is not fitting to your fine sensations. Come to the hut upon the mountain. The sun is yet high in the heavens, before it descends to hide itself behind your snowy precipices and illuminate another world. You will have heard my story and can decide. On you it rests whether I quit forever the neighborhood of man and lead a harmless life, or become the scourge of fellow creatures and the author of your own speedy ruin. As he said this, he led the way across the ice. I followed. My heart was full, and I did not answer him. But as I proceeded, I weighed the various arguments that he had used and determined at least to listen to his tale. I was partly urged by curiosity, and compassion confirmed my resolution. I had hitherto supposed him to be the murderer of my brother, and I eagerly sought a confirmation or denial of this opinion. For the first time also, I felt that the duties of a creator towards his creature were, and that I ought to render him happy before I complained of his wickedness. These motives urged me to comply with his demand. We crossed the ice, therefore, and ascended the opposite rock. The air was cold, and the rain again began to descend. We entered the hut, the fiend with an air of exultation, I with a heavy heart and depressed spirits. But I consented to listen, and seating myself by the fire which my odious companion had lighted, he thus began his tale. Okay, so there's so much in these chapters that is pretty powerful. Chapter 8, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on. This is the trial, where Elizabeth does testify on behalf of Justine, but Justine is still found guilty and is executed. There's a lot of comments in here, some horrible things that Victor is reflecting upon his creature. There's a beautiful writing in here, this beautiful sentence where it says, "The fangs of remorse tore my bosom and would not forego their hold." I just think that's incredible writing. Elizabeth goes to visit Justine in her prison cell and takes Victor with her, not realizing the torture that this would put on Victor. He says, "I bore a hell within me which nothing could extinguish." What a beautiful line. Another beautiful line in here, he describes the saintly sufferer, Elizabeth as the saintly sufferer. And then there's the second to the last paragraph in chapter 8. From the tortures of my own heart, I turned to contemplate the deep and voiceless grief of Elizabeth. This also was my doing. So sorry. He goes on in that paragraph to describe how he caused all the pain of his family and what this has done to him. And we end with some foreshadowing where he says that William and Justine were the first hapless victims of his unhallowed arts. Okay, chapter 9 opens, "Nothing is more painful to the human mind after the feelings have been worked up by a quick succession of events, the dead calmness of inaction and certainty which follows and deprives the soul of both hope and fear." Those moments and days after death, after someone has died and you're left alive trying to figure things out. We have some great alliteration at the end of the second paragraph where he says, "Deep, dark, deathlike solitude." That alliteration is just to kind of accentuate and punctuate the severity of the wording there. In this paragraph, or in this chapter, when Mary Shelley starts to describing grief and talking about the pain of loss and losing a child, whenever Victor's father speaks of it, this is something that Mary Shelley is very familiar with, as having lost her own child. Victor talks about rowing across the lake and being tempted to throw himself into the lake, but realizes that if he does that, he is just leaving his family to suffer at the hands of his creature. He does start to acknowledge himself as the author of the unalterable evils. He doesn't quite describe himself as the creator, but he does describe himself as the author. He decides that he wants to go out into nature and try to find some hope and some peace. Let's see. He has a great simile in here where he says, "I was encompassed by a cloud which no beneficial influence could penetrate." This is a metaphor, excuse me. The wounded deer dragging its fainting limbs to some untrodden brake, there to gaze upon the arrow which had pierced it, and to die was but a type of me. What a beautiful line. At one point, Elizabeth says to him, "Alas, Victor, when falsehood can look so like the truth, who can assure themselves of certain happiness?" As Elizabeth is trying to deal with the horror of Justine being killed. So then, as I said, Victor decides to go off into nature, which is a very romantic quality. He decides to go off and try to find some peace and hope in the glaciers. And nature, which were associated with the light-hearted gaiety of his boyhood. Chapter 10 opens with another stark description of nature and romanticism and what it should be bringing him. I remember the effect that the view of the tremendous and ever-moving glacier had produced upon my mind when I first saw it. It had then filled me with the sublime ecstasy that gave wings to the soul and allowed it to soar from the obscure world to light and joy. Beautiful, beautiful romanticism. As he travels across this glacier to the mountains, he talks about how uneven the ground is, and then out of nowhere, the creature finds him and runs at him with superhuman speed. He describes it as abhorred, and he starts saying, the thing that I had created, bitter anguish combined with disdain and malignity, while its unearthly ugliness rendered it almost too horrible for human eyes. He calls it a devil and a vile insect and a demon. And then the creature responds, all men hate the wretched, but how when I be hated, whom am miserable beyond all living things, yet you, my creator, detests and spurn me? How dare you sport thus with life? I will glut the maw of death until it be satiated with the blood of your remaining friends. You are my creator. I should be loved by you. I was abandoned by you. Have I not suffered enough that you seek to increase my misery? Life, although it may be only an accumulation of anguish, is dear to me. I am thy creature. Me alone to whom thy justice and even the clemency and affection is most due. Remember that I am your creature. I ought to be your Adam. I was benevolent and good. Misery made me a fiend. How can I move you? Will no entreaties cause you to turn a favorable eye upon your creature who implores you of goodness and compassion? Believe me, Frankenstein, I was benevolent. My soul glowed with love and humanity. You, my creator, abhor me. Hear me. You accuse me of murder, yet you would, with a satisfied conscience, destroy your own creature? You did this to me. I was innocent and happy and filled with love and benevolence, and you abandoned me. And if this is what I have to do to get your attention, this is what I will do. You created this, and now it is up to you to end it. Very powerful.